Autism, also known as autism spectrum disorder, is a condition characterized by differences or difficulties in social communication and interaction, a need for strong preference for predictability and routine, sensory processing differences, focused interests, and repetitive behaviors. Autism has become a very popular subject over the past few years. People are consistently getting diagnosed more and more each day, and I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to how exactly it's been represented in movies. I've found throughout my research that it's actually a very broad topic that is discussed in a very linear fashion. I've studied, researched, and talked with many people who've spent lots of time on this subject, and one of the most common things I hear is that each case is different. There has never and will never be a perfect set of qualities and recognizable aspects to be able to be applied to an autistic character, because autism itself is something that's educated and advertises no uniform example for which it gets represented. There has never and will never be a perfect set of qualities and recognizable aspects to be able to be applied to an autistic character, because autism itself is something that's educated and advertises no uniform example for which it gets represented. When it comes to modern cinema, I feel it's really getting integrated into many more examples, consciously or not. I personally feel the collective films of Yorgos Lanthimos, Bong Joon-ho, and Wes Anderson are complete filmographies that heavily lean into each character being realistically uncomfortable and, well,
different. Are you a bully? You're starting to sound like a bully.
It is very difficult to properly examine autism in film because one of the known differences that comes with autism spectrum disorder is the tendency to hone technically abnormal hyperfixations upon certain topics, franchises, trades, etc. This is especially difficult to categorize because around 99% of every single film ever made carries a drive within the main character. Now, obviously, I'm being pretty broad, as not all characters are made equally, and every character has levels of involvement in their story because of different means. I could go on, but I do think this is very important to note when mentioning this subject on film, because subtext plays a really pivotal role in identifying it within a lot of stories. Now, with that being said, I garnered an extended assortment of films once I included ones which have what I felt to be subtly appropriate subtext. Like, saying certain films aren't about autism just doesn't feel truthful. Like, okay, these films aren't about autistic characters in the same way these films aren't about queer characters. At some point, the stuff that is being displayed is hinted at so clearly and bluntly no other conclusion can be made other than the fact that the subtext is just text. Unfortunately, it is not very difficult at all to find bad representation of autism within the history of cinema and media in general.
I wish Freddy Krueger would come and chop off your head and it would roll in the street.
On top of being in bad taste, these films are just poorly made, usually bereft of anything truly interesting or empathetic to say or worth being remembered. And the messed up part is that it can be done well and informed with tact despite how inherently disrespectful it can look. And funnily enough, the opposite is also very true. Forrest Gump is objectively a fantastic movie. A critical and commercial smash hit baby boomer fantasy classic that inspires empathy, respect, and kindness for the mentally challenged, while somewhat critical of certain American groups of the 20th century, all of which the film makes out to seem pretentious from a certain point of view. People have always really cared about Forrest Gump and really like him despite or even because of his perceptual eccentricities, which I think should classify as great representation despite being cast as a fully functioning pop actor of the time. There was a long wave of filmmakers that tried to pull off the same kind of story for years without any of the charm, knowledge, or restrained skill and thought that made Gump the classic it still is for many people. It can be due to a performance obviously going undercooked or under-researched, but usually it can be due to a script that masks itself as performative and ultimately patronizing, which creates a story that ends up feeling offensively poor and probably corny in hindsight. Now we'll go ahead and look at more specific examples from subjective viewpoints. Meantime may be the granddaddy of modern examples, coming out in 1983. One of the film's characters is a mentally impaired young man who struggles with social interactions as well as getting emotionally abused by almost each and every character in the story. Honestly, it is pretty hard to discuss what makes this character so amazing because it is largely based upon the performance and the film's writing. One of the clearer connections that can be made is actually a direct correlation between the character in this film and the character in the Safdie brothers film Good Time. They're very similar characters, but in my opinion, the guy in Good Time is one of the best I've ever seen in my life, so... Beau is Afraid is a very divisive film about a middle-aged man with extreme anxiety trying to get to his mom's house. The film, from a regular perspective, makes no sense for a lot of different reasons. There are many different ways to interpret this film, but one that has always been dealt into each theory is that the world we see is something that is experienced subjectively. The film's often been viewed by many people who suffer from similar mental dysfunctions who feel very identified with the protagonist and seen when in comparison to his nightmarish play. But whether intentionally or not, it still counts as proper representation. Eraserhead is another one of these films where the main character feels like a person who resides in a world whose DNA seems to have been directly built from the things that make him uncomfortable and fearful. Sometimes I Think About Dying is a very strange but wonderful little movie from 2013. It's about a woman named Fran who works at an office. She finds cozy comfort in her intrusive thoughts. Fran does suffer from a subtle form of autism. Not something shown with extreme subjective gravitas, but something a lot more boring and generally discomforting, which is shown to amplify her introvert behavior. It's an example of autistic cinema that's wrapped around and become one of the best in my opinion, as it displays dysfunction in a very humanistic, realistic way. Still subjective, but prioritizing relatability above all else. Gummo. Oh boy. If you don't know, Gummo is a film shot in Nashville about the remaining inhabitants of a Midwestern town that was destroyed by a tornado in the 70s and was never put back together. The majority of the film's characters are children, which makes it all the more shocking. The film is entirely made up of vignettes that make up the town and the pitch black morals everyone in the film resides in. Very autistic and disabled characters informed by their murky, unattractive surroundings.
I got this thing called ADD. It's an attention disorder. Affects the nervous system. It makes it hard to concentrate.
The film throughout its runtime displays scenarios and people living the worst lives imaginable. The film almost feels very similar to a circus freak show and begins to feel exploitative of these people, leaving the audience to feel totally separate and hypercritical of everything within the film. And then the ending happens. The film ends with an emotional rainstorm evoking a small moment of self-realization with the closest thing we have to a main character, and we are shown archival footage of the tornado with the needle drop of Roy Orbison's crying. The ending totally recontextualizes the film from an exploitation black comedy into the aftermath of a tragedy. The things that Gummo says are entirely unique. The film displays a culture ravaged with apathy and negligence towards mental health, and the criticism is redirected from the film's people and into the audience as if to say, what are you going to do about it? On subsequent rewatches, the film teaches the audience to take everything in a much more casual way. It's still very twisted, but there's a real guidance of empathy towards and for education on tolerance and vulnerability towards people with mental handicaps. Yeah, in the attempt to research for autism in cinema, there's just so much that cannot be tackled in such a short amount of time. Seriously, I had like this many examples. I find it a very, very interesting subject. Thank you for watching.